started. My name is Lana. I'm an environmental justice organizer in the city, and I'm with the Center for Social Justice. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we're on Indigenous territories, that of the Mississauga, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron, and maybe other nations before that. Tonight's talk is sponsored by Socialist Project, Center for Social Justice, the Chair in Comparative Political Economy at York University, and Rising Tide Toronto. The talk is kind of a continuation of an ecology series that the Center for Social Justice organized in the first half of the year. We had 7 talks, many of you were there, covering a range of ecological issues, including tar sands and Indigenous rights, green jobs, carbon markets, and so forth. So continuing with the theme of ecology, today we want to look at kind of the bigger political picture of climate change. And the intersection between climate change and conflict and migration and neoliberalism and so on, which Christian Parenti will be talking about. And of course, as always, Canada is part of the problem. We are one of the top 10 emitters in the world, and we have enough reserves to take us over the 2-degree limit that has been agreed upon. That would be, the limit that we cannot pass. And in fact, it's much lower than that because at 2 degrees, a lot of the global south will be in crisis. Already is, in fact. And our biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions is the tar sands. Of course, it's also the fastest growing source of greenhouse gas emissions. And there are plans to continue extracting. Fortunately, we're seeing a bit of a slowdown right now as a result of low oil prices and resistance, actually. And a study just came out 2 days ago from the Oil Change International and other organizations concluding that pipeline resistance has worked, has been successful, and as a result is essentially stopping the expansion of the tar sands. Yes. Yes, it's pretty encouraging. And it's because something like 98%, or the current pipelines are at 98% capacity, and so new projects can't go online. They simply wouldn't be able to get the product out for export. And so a lot of projects are being canceled, and just 2 days ago, one of Shell's projects got canceled specifically because of a lack of pipelines that they would be able to use to get the product out to sea and out for export, which is where the tar sands are going. So as we've seen, there has been a lot of pipeline resistance across the country and in the United States as well. So going west, we have Northern Gateway, Kinder Morgan. Going south, we have Keystone XL, and to a lesser extent, the Alberta Clipper. And east, we have Line 9 and Energy East, most recently. And often these movements are led by Indigenous communities, but also grassroots supporters and sometimes the environmental NGOs as well. Since the book was published in 2011, for example, in some of the Arab Spring countries that experienced droughts prior to the uprisings and contributed to the conflict, and now some of these countries are the ones that are having mass migration problems. So to talk about all of that, we're happy to have Christian Parenti with us here from New York. Christian Parenti is an investigative journalist, academic, author. He has reported from Afghanistan, Iraq, Venezuela, Bolivia, Ivory Coast, China, writing for publications such as The Nation, London Review of Books, and Mother Jones. His books include The Freedom, Shadows and Hallucinations in Occupied Iraq, The Soft Cage, Surveillance in America from Slavery to the War on Terror, Lockdown America, Police and Prisons in the Age of Crisis, and his most recent book, The Tropic of Chaos, Climate Change and the New Geography of Violence, is the one where he addresses climate change as causing violence and interacting with neoliberalism and militarism. He is a professor in the Global Liberal Studies program at New York University, and we're very pleased to have him with us today.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Really nice to be here in Toronto in a slightly more civilized version of kind of Anglo-Saxon style capitalism. And it's nice to be on indigenous land and to be in a place where there's such robust and effective resistance to the infrastructure of fossil fuels. It really is. The activism that the introduction outlined is one of the things that I find really, heartening in a landscape that is otherwise pretty disheartening. So the book, the book began as an idea when I was reporting in Afghanistan, and I did a series of stories about poppy and heroin, and they were separated by about 2 years, and each time they were in different regions, and each time when I was asking farmers why they grew this illegal crop and took the risks that were involved with that, part of the answer they always gave was, it's really drought resistant. Poppy's really drought resistant. And at the time, I didn't even realize there was a drought. I mean, I sort of maybe realized, but I didn't really quite understand that. And in fact, it turned out that Afghanistan was going through the worst drought in living memory at that time. And poppy uses 1/5 to 1/6 the amount of water that wheat and orchard crops that are the typical crops in Afghanistan use. And so it occurred to me that even in that war, which is not about climate change, it has many other origins and causes, there's a climatological element to it. And the climatological element to it was that this drought pushes farmers to grow poppy, and in the war there are two sides on the question of poppy and opium and heroin. The then Karzai government, the Ashraf Ghani government, and supported by NATO, the position is to eradicate this crop. It's illegal, and this was, policy was created under pressure, particularly from the United States, particularly from the religious right in the United States that had no idea what this meant. The US military and the Bush administration, actually, to their credit, at first were like, no, we're not going to deal with poppy, this is ridiculous. But under pressure, domestic pressure, like, no, we've got to come down on this drugs. So they create this eradication program. And the other side of the conflict, the Taliban, their position on poppy is, we'll protect you. This is one of the only crops that you can make a living at, fine. You grow this crop and we'll tax it the way we'll tax any other crop. And in exchange for running out the eradication squads and keeping areas safe for these farmers to grow poppy in, the implicit contract is, you in turn shelter our wounded, you hide weapons for us, you pay these taxes, and so you can see how a young Afghan farmer faced with this condition would be driven into the arms of the Taliban. And that it's not to reduce the Taliban to some sort of climatologically driven movement, but that this is one thing, along with ethnic nationalism. The Taliban is very much a Pashtun nationalist force, and along with religious conviction, there's this sort of practical thing, which is like, under these environmental conditions, poppy's the only crop that's feasible. It doesn't matter what you want to do, how you feel about this, you're not going to be able to feed your family if you try and grow wheat. But you can if you grow poppy. And one side will facilitate your ability to literally survive. And so I thought, okay, so even in this very complex war, there's a climatological driver. There's a climate driver in this. I'll bet if I go looking around, there will be other examples of this. So I set out on a long tour over many years looking into this question. And sure enough, there are plenty of examples of this. And what I found was that climate change rarely drives violence on its own, in isolation, right? It is always bound up with, imbricated with other problems, and in particular, two pre-existing crises. And those pre-existing crises, which climate change now comes in to exacerbate, are the legacy of 30 years of neoliberal economic restructuring pushed by the Bretton Woods institutions, World Bank, IMF, upon the developing economies economies of the world to liberalize their economies, to deregulate, to privatize state assets, to cut state spending on healthcare, education, agricultural extension, etc., right? So to reduce the state to its bare, raw police functions. That has created, across the global south, is just primed country after country, economy after economy for instability by creating increased inequality again and again. Sometimes neoliberalism has been associated with rising rates of growth, as in India. Usually it hasn't been, as in Latin America, where the 1980s, which were the decade of neoliberalism, did not perform in the terms that were suggested that it would. There was not high rates of growth. There was stagnation. But always, even when there's high rates of growth, which is rare, there's always increased inequality. And that is destabilizing. The other pre-existing crisis that climate change always interacts with is the legacy of Cold War militarism and increasingly war on terror militarism. And the Cold War littered much of the global south with cheap weaponry and men, I use that word advisedly, trained in the arts of asymmetrical warfare. You know, they're either former cops or former insurgents. So, you know, networks and groups of men who know how to use small arms, know how to ambush, know how to, you know, conduct sabotage, etc., etc. And with the end of the Cold War, the great animating ideological cause disappeared, but those skills, those networks didn't, and they're still there on the landscape at the same time that neoliberalism is just stripping away every possible form of support for the population in much of the global south. So then onto this stage, preset for crisis, now starts coming the extreme weather associated with climate change. Algae blooms, droughts, etc., etc. And these push people who live off the land, farmers, fisher communities, over the edge economically. And so to adapt, frequently, people turn to the only resources they have available, which are these weapons and these military skills left over from the Cold War. In reaction to the intensified economic crisis and inequality created by neoliberalism and the more direct triggering crisis of climate change, these networks, militarized networks, are reinvigorated, reinvented as religious fanaticism, ethnic nationalism, criminal networks, banditry, etc., etc. So I called this combination of these three forces interacting the catastrophic convergence. And it doesn't always play out equally. It's not like always one part climate change, one part neoliberalism, one part militarism. In different countries, you see different combinations. So the book begins in Kenya, where in the wake of a cattle raid in which several people have been killed, and there's this guy named Ekuru Lorman lying dead at my feet, and I asked, you know, what killed this guy? Why did Ekuru Lorman die? And the situation there is there's been intense drought in the Horn of Africa, punctuated by extreme flooding. So actually, interestingly, over the last 30 years, overall precipitation levels in Kenya have increased. But the pattern is one of persistent drought. You ask people on the ground, what are the conditions? They say drought. And it's because the rain is coming all at once at the wrong time in these sudden deluges. So when I was in the Turkana region, it was bone dry. The acacia trees, which have evolved to deal with this kinds of long-term drought. A lot of them were dying, and it looked like bleached out driftwood, and the Turkana women were turning them into charcoal to sell to truckers going into South Sudan. This is just the desperate level of survival. So, and then shortly after I left, there was a huge downpour and there was flooding, and then that of course just strips the soil down and the water isn't captured, so the overall effect is drought. So Kenya has been one of the first countries subject to neoliberal economic restructuring beginning in the early 90s, and the effect is that the Kenyan state really does not have the capacity to do much for pastoralists like Ekuru Lorman, who was of the Turkana people, and they are herders primarily, and their entire culture and economy is structured around cattle. And all of the forage for the cattle, is dead. And so what happens is people concentrate around the few water holes, around the rivers, around what, few resources remain, which just helps to exacerbate conflicts in and of itself and makes people more vulnerable. So the Turkana, they would turn to the state for assistance, but there was really nothing there. I mean, the only capacity that I found interviewing local officials going around in the Turkana that the state had was famine kind of preparation. That was it. There was no agricultural extension. They didn't even have the capacity for well drilling, which you could argue is not the best way to adapt, mining the aquifer, but in a short-term sense that that would be reasonable. So what do people do? Well, their herds get sick, their herds die. To replenish their herds, they go to steal their neighbors' herds. And this is part of the culture, part of the economy of in the pastoralist corridor in East Africa. It's been this way forever. But the introduction of guns, lots of cheap guns, first with colonialism, but then with the Cold War and the proxy fights of the Cold War, mean that region is now totally awash with guns. So people who have very little material possessions other than their cattle and maybe a little radio almost always have an AK-47 and some weaponry. And that's because first there was the collapse of the Ugandan state temporarily with the collapse of the Idi Amin regime. Idi Amin was had military hardware lavished on him. The fall of his regime led to the looting of armories. That was sort of the first big pulse of weaponry into that region. But then the real source of all the guns is Somalia. And Somalia is a perfect example of how the Cold War and how U.S. militarism and U.S. proxy wars, which is not unique to the Cold War, that is still central to U.S. military practice, how that destabilizes. So in Somalia, what you had was a socialist revolution in 1969. Said Barre comes into power. He declares scientific socialism, as he calls it, to be compatible with Islam and the pastoralist lifestyle. But more than anything, he's a Somali nationalist, and he wants to unite all the Somali-speaking homelands. And so almost immediately starts a sort of covert guerrilla war in Ethiopia, where there's a large Somali-speaking region, the Ogden region, and that war continues to this day. There's then a socialist coup in 1974, I believe is the date, in Ethiopia. And for a moment there you had actually the Cubans and the Soviets supporting both of these states that were inadvertently essentially fighting this covert war against each other. It becomes an overt war when Said Barre finds out that the Soviets and Cubans are supporting his enemies in Ethiopia, and to their credit, the idea, Fidel Castro was trying to create this alliance, a sort of swarming of small socialist states, his goal was not in any way to lead to what eventually happens. Said Barre realizes this and switches sides and immediately approaches the United States and the Western camp in the Cold War, and the Carter administration starts pouring weaponry and money into Somalia through Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. And so then what you have from the late 70s through the 1980s into to 1990, when Somalia collapses, is this local conflict driven by a kind of irredentist agenda of a local leader being taken up into the larger scheme of the Cold War, in which these two great camps are on either side the best of intentions. You can evaluate those intentions as you see fit, but pouring resources into this conflict. And the end result was ultimately the total fragmentation of the Somali military along clan lines and the collapse of that state. And it's still a failed state, and it's the first sort of modern failed state, post-Cold War failed state. It collapses in first weeks of January 1991. And just ever since has been leaching out weaponry into that region. So people like Ekuru Lorman have no support from the state. Their environment is in crisis, and one of the few resources they have is cheap weaponry. And so the cattle conflict becomes increasingly violent, and these raids become increasingly military, paramilitary, involve cross-border actions by state militaries even. So that's a pretty clear example of the catastrophic convergence of all these three components coming together. An example where it's less evenly balanced was Kyrgyzstan. In Kyrgyzstan, there was in 2010, you might remember, violence between Kyrgyz and Uzbeks. And the capital city, parts of it went up in flames momentarily. One government fell, a new government came in, requested Russian military involvement. The Russians wisely declined, having had previous experiences in small mountainous countries in Central Asia. And eventually it subsided, but the headlines just read out sort of ethnic conflict, Kyrgyz versus Uzbeks at each other's throats again. But the underlying story was, again, a climate story to some extent. Kyrgyzstan is unique in that it has a very high proportion of its energy from hydroelectric. Most of this comes from large Soviet-built dams, particularly the Toktala Dam. And the same drought that has been hammering Afghanistan was hammering Kyrgyzstan and that entire region. And the water levels in the dam had, by 2005, reached record lows. Kyrgyzstan, like much of the former Soviet Union, had implemented structural adjustment, shock therapy, in the 1990s. It was so brutal in Kyrgyzstan that they had to stop it in the late 90s and around 2000. So privatizations had ceased. There was endemic unemployment and all of the problems of inequality and resentment, what sociologists call relative deprivation, this idea that people don't experience poverty and deprivation just in terms of their isolated experience, but in relationship to what could be, what once was, what should be, what some leader or demagogue is telling you is possible, or particularly what others have. So when people are immiserated and then they see that there's this new elite flaunting it and blatantly doing nothing for the people, that produces criminality, militarism of political and apolitical varieties. So anyway, the water levels are at the lowest level ever. There's an economic crisis. The government decides they're going to restart the privatization program. And the first asset they're going to sell is the utility. And the way they're going to make this asset more attractive is by boosting the amount of money that people have to pay. So they double the tariff with a promise to then triple it. So people, and then on top of this, there is an extremely cold and dry winter, 2008. And cattle herds are freezing on the mountains. Pipes are bursting in these old Soviet buildings. People are literally freezing to death. And so the economy is in really bad shape, and they have to, due to this really bad winter, they have to start rationing power because the dam is not able to produce enough power because the water levels are even lower. So they're rationing power. That means that what industry exists now has to start cutting back. So bakeries and other factories, they can't operate to full capacity. People start getting laid off. There's less demand. There's a further contraction of the economy. And so in the spring of 2010, there begins a protest that is about these conditions. It's about the lack of opportunity, the lack of education, and the suffering of the people. This was a class movement, essentially. It wasn't particularly sophisticated in articulating itself as such, but that was the nature of the set of demands. But the crisis, the economic crisis of the post-Soviet era in Kyrgyzstan was such that it had produced groups of essentially lumpenized young men who didn't have jobs, they hadn't gone to school, and they basically became increasingly segregated into their Uzbek or Kyrgyz communities and hung out with each other and let their anger fester and hung out in casinos and drank. And this kind of lumpenized vanguard ultimately seizes this movement, and it turns from a mass popular rebellion around these basic issues into an ethnic pogrom of Kyrgyz versus Uzbeks. And this time it was the Kyrgyz having the upper hand against the Uzbeks. And traditionally the Kyrgyz were the more nomadic people, and they historically felt dominated by the Uzbeks. So this was sort of payback to the Uzbeks. And so you can see that a number of things in this. That even in these urbanized contexts where people aren't living directly off the land, and it's not obvious why their deprivation has some environmental angle, that it doesn't take much scratching around to realize, oh yeah, there's obviously a link. It may be attenuated through space and time and certain technologies such as the infrastructure of the utility and the dam, but even that conflict had a climatological angle. Other examples, India is a big sort of part of the book. And in India you have one of the longest running insurgencies in modern history, the Naxalites, the Maoist rebellion in eastern India. And this begins in after a massacre in 1968 in Naxalbari, which is in the northeast of India. And over the 40 plus years of this rebellion's history, there have been a kind of series of formations. And there are several different parties and military groups, but the catchphrase for these rebels are the Naxalites. And what's interesting is that in the last 10 years, the Naxalites have essentially broken out of their northeastern traditional area and have started moving down along the Eastern Ghats, which is the interior mountains of eastern India. And it's possible to track the movement of Naxalite activity district by district onto districts most affected by drought. So this is simultaneously called the Red Corridor and also the Drought Corridor. So I went there to figure out, well, what's the connection here? And the interconnection is, interestingly enough, the role of cotton in all this. So India also embraces radical, a kind of a robust, aggressive neoliberalism in the early 90s. This involves, among other things, pulling back various types of agricultural extension, the state pulling back its role in local finance, etc. The farmers, I was in what is now Telangana, the new state, northern Andhra Pradesh, and the farmers there had taken to growing BT cotton, and this had kind of made its way up through trade networks from the coast. And at first, they found that BT cotton improved yields. They had greater yields. But then, in fact, they had to use more fertilizer and more pesticides, and it just stripped the soil out. And they were very clear about this, but they were trapped in this process. It's not so easy as to, to get out of this. Yeah, we're like mining the soil, we're destroying it. But so the problem in all this, and the reason they couldn't get out of the cotton, was partly due to the credit system. And the way that farmers get credit due to the state's withdrawal of providing a kind of semi-socialist developmentalist credit system is turning to moneylenders. The moneylenders won't lend money for food crops as collateral for fear that the farmers will, quote unquote, steal the collateral, eat the crops. They will advance seed, BT cotton seed and pesticide, et cetera, because that is a type of insurance for them. They know that the farmers can do nothing with that crop except sell it, turn it into money, and then the moneylenders get their money. So this is how the farmers in Telangana and other areas of India are caught in this process that economists call immiserizing growth. So the sort of growth of cotton production, yet the prices are going down and the well-being of the people are declining. And across India, I'm sure many of you have heard this, over 200,000 farmers have committed suicide in response to these debts. In Andhra Pradesh, it was around about 2,000 cases of this had been documented. So you can imagine you're one of these farmers and you're about to commit suicide. And the way that farmers typically commit suicide in a kind of horrendous sort of poetic statement, yeah, it's drinking the pesticide meant for the plant, the cotton plant. So you can imagine if you're about to drink pesticide and some Naxalite activist comes along and says, hey, instead of suicide, how about political homicide? You know? And the Naxalites essentially provide a short-term and a long-term plan for people. They say, you know, the long-term project is we're going to take state power and we're going to have a Maoist-style socialist revolution and everything's going to be better. Now, a farmer and you in the audience may or may not, you know, believe in that. It may or may not make sense, but the short-term project certainly would. Say, you know, and the next time the moneylenders come to the village, we're going to stop their car, we're going to pull the moneylender out, and we'll shoot them. And when the cops come, the paramilitary police squads come to investigate, we'll ambush them and we'll shoot them too. And we'll mine the roads and we will free you from this oppression, from these moneylenders and from these thugs in blue uniforms with machine guns who back them up. And if you're on the verge of drinking poison, why not? Give it a shot, right? And thus, the Naxalites followed drought. And there you have, you know, you can see clearly how neoliberalism becomes the catalyzing agent for the climate crisis to deepen. So there's a lot of climate violence in the global south, clearly, but there's also climate violence in the north, right? There are the militarized responses of NATO, of the US, of the core economy militaries are also a form of climate violence in that they are to some extent reacting to this and pushed by this. Also, border militarization. So in researching that question, I went to northern Mexico and to look into essentially the question of how much migration is climate related. Who is a climate migrant? And sure enough, it didn't take much questioning to find that a lot of people who were trying to get to the US had stories of environmental crisis that were pushing them along. So I met a group of Tarahumara Indians who were living in Juarez, and this was at the height of the violence in Juarez. Juarez has since become considerably more peaceful than it was several years ago. And they left their region because of drought, made crops impossible to grow. In the face of the failure of their crops, they turned increasingly to timber harvesting. This exacerbated conditions by accelerating erosion, et cetera, and so they were forced to migrate to Juarez, work in the construction sector, try and get to the US. I interviewed a guy who was sitting on the southern bank of the Rio Grande, looking into the US, totally distraught. He'd recently been deported. He'd been a fisherman in Michoacan, and a red tide, it had an algal bloom associated with an El Nino event, had not the big El Nino of 1997, 98, but a smaller El Nino in the 2000s, had caused the water to warm and there was an algal bloom. And that drove away the fish. And he was a small artisanal fisher person. So that one bad season meant he had to go into debt. He went into debt to the private sector. There was no security, and he lost all his gear. Well, why did that happen? That happened because of neoliberalism, right? That happened because of the debt crisis of the 1980s, the United States in particular, but all the Western financial interests used that as an opportunity to force Mexico into a process of profound deregulation. And Mexico had what was considered the first socialist constitution. The Mexican Constitution of 1919 is very explicit. It had this Article 27 that said basically like everything, every single thing in Mexico down to the rock salt, everything in the country belongs to the state. And private property exists, but only at the pleasure of the state. It builds in the ejido system, which was a form of communal land ownership in which peasants could not use their land as collateral, and therefore their land could not be lost in debt crises. Article 27 is removed as part of the preparations for the North American Free Trade Act. The ejido system, which before the restructuring had about 40% of farmland was held in the ejido system. The ejido system is badly damaged. There were all sorts of parastatal companies involved in fishing and agriculture, these sorts of things that propped up small producers like this man I met in Juarez. So all that had been stripped away. He's dealing with this red tide. He's got a bad year. He borrows money. He can't pay it back. He loses his gear. He works in commercial fishing for a little while. That's not working out. So he migrates to America. He becomes a roofer in Las Cruces, New Mexico, and then he's deported and he's thrown back into Juarez. And he said, you know, he had just talked to his former boss in Las Cruces, and the guy was like, if you can get back here, you can have your job back. And the guy's sitting there like, how am I going to get across this border? It costs $3,000. I mean, the only way I could get any money like that is to get involved in the drug trade here, you know? And so you can see, okay, so there's a climatological element that's helping to drive that violence. I mean, that's not the primary thing, obviously. I mean, there was a lot of other, it was in many ways, it was the defeat of the PRI, the 70-year rule of the PRI had kind of regulated corruption. And when the PAN came in, there was a kind of disruption and deregulation of the underworld, and so there was this kind of criminal war erupted. But the foot soldiers in that criminal war were very frequently people who could be described as climate migrants. So that border that this former fisherman is looking at, our border, or the US border, it has been increasingly militarized since the early 1990s. The U.S. Border Patrol, if it were a military, would have one of the largest air forces in the world. And on the north side of the border, you can see there's a type of climate violence that increasingly in places like Arizona, where there's a profoundly xenophobic, explicitly racist kind of politics that has produced stuff like SB 1070, which was an Arizona state law that made it mandatory for the police to check the IDs of people that they thought were possibly undocumented immigrants. It also made it possible for citizens to sue individual police officers that the citizens might have suspected of not vigorously enforcing this law. These kinds of things are, I mean, that's endemic and part and parcel of American history, but increasingly there's an element of a kind of right-wing environmentalists who support this, who are like, yes, there is an environmental crisis, it's very real, and the solution is to, you know, build a moat, arm ourselves, keep the world out as it collapses. And so that's an explicit sort of form of climate violence, and at any given night in the United States there are usually about 30,000 people held in detention, in immigration detention, frequently in really appalling conditions. They have very few legal rights because they're not, you know, U.S. citizens. There's my first book was about policing and prisons, and there's often a kind of misrecognition that the whole criminal justice buildup in the United States has been driven by private prisons, etc. Actually, private prisons only constitute about 8% of all prison beds. It's much harder than it looks to run a prison, and it's hard to do that profitably, except for in immigration, partly because immigrants aren't the people that Donald Trump describes, right? They're hardworking, regular people. They're pretty easy to push around and treat poorly and house in substandard conditions without having massive violent riots, without having your guards shanked with homemade knives. So actually, the immigration detention is primarily privatized. So that too is a form of climate violence. And increasingly we see climate violence in the open-ended war on terror. The war on terror is increasingly about responding to the crisis, the climate crisis. And so this is clear in the Arab Spring. In 2010, 2011, due to drought in in Kazakhstan and Ukraine and Russia, drought and flooding in the United States and Canada and Australia, extreme weather in all the major grain growing regions of the world. There was a huge spike in basic grain prices. Wheat went up about 83%, corn went up 91%, and that in that 1 year. And so in 2011, we have the beginning of the Arab Spring. What was the first thing that people were demanding? First place where this begins is in Tunisia. And one of the things they're demanding is lower food prices. People were holding loaves of bread. One of the last things Ben Ali did before he fled the country was promise to lower food prices. Similarly in Egypt. And so you have to ask, why in these places where there had been brutal kleptocratic governments like Egypt for 30 years, why was the rebellion, why did it happen when it happened? Why didn't it happen 5 years earlier or 5 years later? And it is, I think, not reducible to, but clearly in part triggered by this surge in basic food prices, almost doubling in basic food prices. And in Egypt, the average person spends 40% of their income on food, which is considerably lower than the global average, which is about 80%. The average person on the planet spends about 80% of their income on food. So that food price spike was partly caused by the climatological patterns associated with climate change, the drought in these grain-producing regions. I should say, as a caveat, one can't say that any one event is caused by climate change, but these events fit the pattern that has been predicted by the more than 14 major climate computer models. And we have enough time now of watching and perfecting these things that the patterns that were predicted are coming to fruition. And so whether or not this or that drought is caused by climate change, clearly all this fits the pattern. So in terms of the Arab Spring, it's clearly a case of an environmental crisis in one place being displaced through time and space into another place. So the key, I'm sort of forgetting to tell you some of the key events. So in response to this 2010-2011 grain crisis and the spike in prices, Russia actually canceled most of its grain export contracts. And this was the summer when Moscow was choked with smoke from forest fires. Things were getting very serious. And so they just canceled all the grain contracts. Speculators, in particular Glencore, the major commodity speculator and mining company, wrote an open letter urging Russia to do this, and that was the basis, that food price spike was the basis for Glencore's $60 billion IPO. Single largest grain importer in the world is Egypt, and they import heavily from Russia. So the food price spike hit Egypt, and that was part of what triggers the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring tragically devolves, collapses into a type of despotism that we see now in Egypt, and in other places into civil war. In Syria. In Syria, there was also a drought. There was the same issue with expensive food. You had migration of sort of poor Sunni farmers into the cities, and then their resentments are politicized in terms of religious affiliation, and so you have this sort of mass, sort of lumpenized Sunni farmers opposing this Alawite regime. And the response of the United States and NATO to this was, as you all know, to bomb Libya, to fuel the jihadist forces in Syria in the name of overthrowing Assad, then to engage in direct combat with special forces and air support. Not U.S. special forces that we know of in Syria, but in Iraq at least. But definitely, we're flying sorties over Syria. So this war that is ongoing, this kind of proxy war with Iran and Russia, it too has a climatological element, and then the war itself produces this huge pulse of refugees out across the Mediterranean. What's the response in Europe? Building walls, a surge in xenophobic right-wing parties. In Austria, the far right had their best showing in recent elections that they've ever had. So those kinds of military intervention, border hardening, a kind of armed lifeboat, crypto-fascist set of policies in the global north, those two are also, as I see it, a type of climate violence. So, not to be a total downer or end on an extremely pessimistic note, I end the book, and increasingly my work is looking at solutions. And as you probably all know, that the watchwords in the climate discussion are mitigation and adaptation. We have to mitigate by reducing carbon emissions. We have to adapt by dealing with the both physical and social changes that we're locked in for, such as rising sea levels and creating bioshields by retreating, allowing mangroves to protect settlements, etc. And also social adaptation, dealing with the fact that there are going to be major refugee flows, and there have to be policies that deal with that. There will be policies that deal with that, right? We see that. There are either going to be walls and militarized borders, or they're going to be a more social democratic and sane acceptance of refugees, which, by the way, is exactly what Europe needs, right? I mean, Europe is not replacing its population. Even countries like Italy, famous for big families, right? I mean, the average Italian has less than 2 children. The average Italian couple, they have like 1.5 children. So Europe is turning into a geriatric ward. Who's going to do all the work, Why not accept these refugees? Why not try and help people by also acknowledging what Europe really needs? Anyway, that's another story. So in terms of that's a different kind of adaptation. Instead, it seems what we're getting is a sort of militarized adaptation of increased xenophobia, border militarization. But really important is mitigation, because the science is quite clear that there are tipping points, and we are at them or we are crossing them. And so this raises the question of short-term versus long-term social change. And I think it's important not to put the two time frames in opposition to each other. We have to struggle at the level of short-term politics and long-term politics. And so what I'm taking issue with here is this idea that the only way to deal with climate change is to overthrow capitalism, right? I do not think that capitalism is sustainable. An economic order that has a growth imperative, which is caused not by ideas and ideology, but by interfirm competition, by the reality of the anarchy of production, which is that every firm has to outcompete every other firm or they will be wiped out, right? So this is what compels firms to constantly outproduce each other and try and grow. A system like that can't exist on a finite planet. But the time frame, if we're going to be realistic about the time frame for building a totally new society, we don't have that amount of time. We have to start cutting carbon emissions. Well, we have started cutting them. Well, we have to radically reduce carbon emissions starting immediately and in the next few decades. And that, sadly, means it's these societies as they exist, more or less, these institutions, that have to at least take the first steps. And I think it's actually possible to force capitalism as it is to deal with mitigation. This is not the same as making capitalism sustainable. This is not the same as dealing with the environmental crisis as a whole, which includes overfishing, deforestation, increased toxicity, right? It's important to recognize that even though climate change is potentially apocalyptic in its implications, read Jim Hanson's chapter in his book on the Venus syndrome. You realize that is not an exaggeration. That's a possibility. Even though climate change is potentially apocalyptic, that doesn't mean that it is the same as the overall environmental crisis. And it's important to treat it as a subsection. And you realize that with proper social movements demanding that states take action to regulate and control and contain capital and channel investment in new directions, that it is totally conceivable that there could be a euthanization of the fossil fuel industry and a building out of a clean energy sector. I think that's totally possible. In the United States, we already have the laws necessary to do this. We have the money, and we have the technology. I mean, globally, there is definitely the technology and the money, and some places need new laws. But in the United States, we already have the laws. We have the Clean Air Act of 1970, amended by a lawsuit, Massachusetts versus EPA, which found that the Environmental Protection Agency had the obligation to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. And this case was settled in 2007, and we have been waiting since 2007 for a series of what are called tailoring rules to prepare plans for, okay, well then, how are we going to do this for the oil refineries? How do we do this for air traffic? How do we do this for existing power plants, new power plants? And the Bush administration just ignored this. The Obama administration said they were going to follow the law, then they ignored it, and only now, towards the end, under pressure, have they started issuing a few of these rules. Anyway, if that law were pursued rigorously, it would mean that industry could burn fossil fuels, but they would have to pay such heavy fines that it would serve as imposing a de facto carbon tax. It would effectively drive the price of dirty energy up, which would help drive down the price of clean energy. There's all the technology, the price of photovoltaics, just to take one example, has been dropping precipitously. It's amazing that even though fossil fuel prices have plummeted, that the price of photovoltaics have almost kept up. They're also dropping, and it is photovoltaics in many places are quite competitive with fossil fuel. And as a result of all this,
what is that?
Photovoltaics,
Yeah.
solar.
Okay.
It's one type. It's the type of solar cell that turns sunlight directly into energy, as opposed to like reflecting sunlight to boil water or oil that then spins a turbine. So in terms of mitigation, I think that there's reason to be optimistic about the possibility of real mitigation, and that's part of what heartens me about these struggles here in Canada against the oil infrastructure. I mean, this is exactly the type of thing we need to do, both for the long term, building a new society, but also in terms of the short term, making these fuels expensive, preventing the infrastructure from being built that will lock us into another generation of their use. And so on that note, just that I do think it is possible, but I think that part of what has to happen is we have to be realistic about what it means to make short-term demands that capitalism as it exists, that capitalist states move against the fossil fuel industry, that they move against capital, to force capital to invest in renewable energy rather than fossil fuel energy. That this is absolutely possible and a reasonable thing to demand, and it should not be seen as something different than struggling for a totally new society. And that, what we have to do is both, because if we only keep our eyes on the far distant horizon of a completely sustainable society, we could neglect the very, very important fight that we need to do so as to buy time to deal with all the other problems and all the other features of the environmental crisis. So on that note, I will end it and open it up for your questions.